Good evening, everybody, and happy holidays. I am Professor Paranormal, Lloyd Auerbach, and I want to welcome you to the last session of this show for 2023. I'll be starting up again in January 7th. Of course, the next two Sundays are Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. So I figured other people would be busy, and I know I'll be busy at least on New Year's Eve. So, anyway, good to have everybody here. Um, Based on some of the pre-show chat, I'll start out with talking about the classes that I'll be teaching for the Ryan Research Center, the Ryan Education Center, starting in actually start the first full week of February is when they're going to start. So one of them, I think Patrick will be happy to hear, is the field investigations class, the basic field investigations class. So for anyone who's interested in learning, I guess, from the parapsychological perspective, how we do actual investigations in contrast, especially to what they do on TV. That is the first stage, the first main class. It is one of the classes, of course, for the field investigator and for the paranormal investigation certificates. We have two different certificate programs as well. So that'll be an 8-week class. Also, associated with that class and with the certificates is a class on equipment and technology. So I'll be talking about everything from EMF sensors to temperature sensors to EVP and other ITC types of devices. Really kind of taking a very close look at what's possible and how you need to judge the technology you might be buying or might be using. Because it's very important that you understand how these things work and actually how you judge them. Since there is no device, unfortunately, that can detect a ghost other than human beings. Oh, maybe some animals as well. And then the third class I'll be teaching, and by the way, that tech class is a 4-week class. The classes will be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I'm not sure which is going to go on Monday. Probably will be the 4-week class at some point. So it may or may not start the first week of February. The others will start that first full week of February. And the third class I'm teaching is called Dreams and Altered States of Consciousness. So it's going to look at how, at altered states in general, to understand all sorts of altered states inducing devices and practices like meditation and sound and light, sensory deprivation, all of those things, as well as dreams in general, and how all of those things relate to psychic ability, psychic functioning. So for the sleep and dreams piece, I'll also talk about sleep paralysis, psychic dreams specifically. It's going to really kind of be a deeper dive into the altered states world as well. And that'll include, yes, it will include drugs, both legal and illegal. And I'll be talking also about nutrition and how things we take for granted, like our food and our drink, actually affect our brain chemistry and might make us more or less psychic. So those are the 3 classes. Again, field investigations, the paranormal tech class, 4 weeks, and then dreams and altered states of consciousness. I'm not sure what John Kruth has lined up for the other classes being taught for that session. I believe they'll be up on the website within a week. They should be definitely up by the 1st of January for people to respond to. And of course, the website is on the description of this page, and it's just simply Rhine, RHINE, edu.org. Okay. Yeah, and by the way, chocolate will be one of the substances that does affect your brain chemistry. I'll be talking about that. Thanks for putting that in there, Tina. Okay, so welcome everybody, and I want to open it up if folks have any questions at all. And of course, I can talk about chocolate too, if we want to talk about that. I will tell you that if any of you have a Trader Joe's anywhere near you, then you should go in and look for the Chocolate Passport, which is a box set of 7 chocolate bars from 7 different countries. They're all dark chocolate, but it's a great way to kind of learn about how chocolate tastes different from other parts of the world. And it's only $10. It's like a bargain, and they only have it at the holidays. So I'll just recommend that right off the bat. Okay. Anybody have any topics or questions before I kind of play with some things here a little bit? And I'll just kind of give it a beat to see if anybody wants to pipe in or pipe up. And it looks like we have a quiet time right now. Well, hi, Jill. Let's see. Paul asking my thoughts on Greg Braden and Joe Dispenza. I'm trying to think. I don't have any specifics to say about either one of them, particularly. And I'm just trying to think here if I can actually put my thoughts into action here. I don't know what to say about that. Dispenza stuff. Some of it's good, some of it's not. It's hard, really hard. Let's switch to something else. All right, just kind of get me back on track here as well. All right, I've got his book, The Becoming Supernatural. I don't have too much else by him at all. There's a number of other books on that. I think that his stuff on placebo and mind matter is probably okay. It's probably good. I haven't read that one. The Becoming Supernatural book, I was just trying to remember which books he wrote. That's why I was stumbling for a little bit. That I was remembering what I actually have and what I've read. I read too many other things by too many people, unfortunately. So anyway, let's go ahead and move on to something else at this point. All right, these guys are both involved in consciousness studies, and I think anybody who's studying consciousness is doing well. So sorry about that brain fart there a little bit. All right, there's another Greg with a B that I confused with Greg Braden, so I have to kind of pull my thoughts together. One thing I can talk about here just briefly is, I'm a parapsychologist, so I study psychic phenomena of all types. And I'm not a laboratory guy. At least I've worked on occasion on controlled stuff, laboratory experiments, but it's been a long time for that. I've consulted with folks in the laboratory, especially on the issues of controls against fraud. But one of the things that's really important, I've had conversations with people about this recently, is that when we talk about psychic functioning, psychic abilities, which includes all the paranormal stuff that we talk about for apparitions, hauntings, poltergeists, all of that, we are talking about effects of consciousness. And consciousness is who we are. Science doesn't have a good definition of that. It's the big question in science right now. And, there's a lot to that question. People are approaching it from different sciences, different perspectives. There's no real agreement. When we look at survival of bodily death, we're talking about survival of consciousness. So really what we're studying with psychic abilities, psychic phenomena, is how consciousness directly connects with the real world. So we're doing consciousness studies. Right. So I see another question here, which can kind of relate here to some extent. You read a book about a rational. That was probably a book called The Rational Psychic by, his name is slipping out of my head right now, by Jack. Oh, I want to remember Jack's name. Can't recall the guy's name. Somebody down in Southern California. He was a psychic, and it's a decent book. You may have spoken to the author. You saw I don't know what kind of evidence you're going to see of psychic ability when you speak to someone. I guess the question is, was he doing a reading for you or not? The answer, and as far as that second question, psychics can lose their abilities. More importantly, they're not psychic all the time. Nobody is psychic all the time. There are plenty of times that people might not be able to do a reading. There are people they might not. Thank you, Dave. It's Jack Rourke, who is a colleague of Barry Taft's, in fact. So, Stephen, just back to you. When you say you spoke to the author, to Jack, you saw no evidence of psychic ability. Was he demonstrating or trying to demonstrate something psychic? Because I had talks with Jack years ago. We were together with Barry Taft on the Queen Mary down in LA, in Southern California, actually Long Beach, and I saw no demonstration or indication of psychic ability. But then he wasn't trying to be psychic. So psychics. I work with a lot of mediums. I've worked with mediums for a very long time. Or I said it was a reading. So if he didn't do a good reading for you, then that may have been just either a bad day. Maybe he lost his abilities. I haven't talked to Jack in quite a while. The question is how he does with readings with other people. Sometimes we fail to connect. Psychics fail to connect, but he should have told you. And I don't know if you gave him feedback at all, but that would have been kind of important. The other thing about this also to know is that in readings, it really depends on how deep one goes into the questions. So what I mean by that is it's easy for someone who is a psychic to provide you with valid information, which also could match what somebody could find on Facebook or other social media. The problem is we'd have to determine whether the psychic actually is a phony who went to Facebook, because this information that's out there about you also is kind of out in the ether, and a real psychic could also pick that same information up that's on Facebook. I would say that the question is not whether or not the person came up with psychic information, but whether they came up with useful information. So that's really important in those circumstances. Yes, some psychics need permission. That is true. It's really dependent on the individual themselves in so many different ways, and how the psychics actually work. I'm not sure. Again, I've not had a reading from Jack, and I've never seen one of his readings. I work with, like I said, I started talking about working with mediums. Most of the mediums I know through the Forever Family Foundation, or the folks I otherwise work with, you wouldn't know they were psychic unless they were doing a reading of some kind. And sometimes they come up with, you can come up with information that may seem like cold reading or general. The fact is, there are factors that definitely all of us react to. So the thing to do is to push that stuff aside and see if anything specific and any good, useful information comes through. And then is that useful information that could not have been known otherwise? That's the big question for that. So I'm sorry you didn't have a good reading with Jack. I've known mediums who can't connect sometimes with any of the people around you. I had a reading from a very good medium, and she was getting stuff supposedly from spirits that were wanting to kind of pass something along to me. None of it made any sense to me. I also have observed her doing readings for other people under very, very good conditions. I've taken her on cases with me, and she's been very good, right on point. So either nobody who I knew who was dead wanted to talk through her at that point, which is always possible, and maybe whoever was trying to come through didn't give information that really was helpful to me or that I recognized. So I can't really say anything about that. Okay, from Ben, does God love the 49ers more than other teams? You're asking the wrong guy. I'm not a football fan. I live in the Bay Area, neither an Oakland A's fan or a 49ers fan. So I can't really address that question. I just saw something. I don't think that we can say that there are any spirits or deities that are basically helping one team over another, especially if it's based on thoughts and prayers. because every team's fans praise the same way that their team's going to win. All right. Tina, you're no god, but it's true for you. Okay. You know, sports is a really interesting thing that kind of gives me a little segue into something. There's a book out there, I don't know if it's still in print, called In the Zone by Rhea White, R-H-E-A, Rhea White, and Michael Murphy. And if you can find a copy of it used, or even its predecessor, which was called The Psychic Side of Sports, pick those up if you are interested at all in any sports stuff. Because they both talk about psychic experiences and consciousness affecting the performance of athletes. And what's really interesting about it is that athletes often go into this thing called the zone, where they kind of fade out of normal thought consciousness, and they can sometimes do some extraordinary things that are often kind of psychic a little bit. So I'm going to hit the questions here, and I'll pop back over to that topic. Dave, you work with two really good psychics, and the best insight you can offer is when they're hot. They're hot. And when they're not, they're not. That is absolutely true. I've seen that. I've worked with psychics who often said basically, in fact, I knew a psychic years ago, very famous psychic called Shawn Robbins back in New York, back in the early 80s. She was all over the National Enquirer, and as she put it, it was because they paid her to make predictions every year. She just simply spitballed predictions. They weren't really technically psychic. But she explained to me that she would get migraines. And she said if she had a migraine, she would normally cancel her appointments. If she had a slight headache or didn't feel psychic because of a migraine coming on, she would offer, if a client is in front of her, she would say to the client, look, I can reschedule you really quickly, but I'm not being psychic right now. But I can and she actually would use the phrase cold reading. I can do a reading of you from observations. And she would say, that's $10. Her readings were normally more than that. So, you know, there are psychics who are really well aware of that. Okay. Graveyard Grog 47, I'm still happy you do not know how football is played. My dad was a TV sports producer. I know how all the games are played, but none of us, including my dad, really wasn't a sports fan. None of it. Well, I guess my nephews are at this point. Was Sybil Leek genuinely psychic? Well, that's it. For those of you who don't know who Sybil Leek was, you should look her up. She was known as the White Witch Queen. She claimed to be the head of the Wiccan religion in the UK, which was a spurious claim, actually. She wrote a lot of books on parapsychology and telepathy and other things. Wrote books on witchcraft and was really kind of a unique personality. I believe you can find an episode of The Amazing Kreskin. If you put in Amazing Kreskin and Sybil Leek into YouTube, you should be able to come up with the Kreskin show, The Amazing Kreskin show, where he interviewed Sybil Leek. Now, was she psychic? She lived for a while in the 1960s in Cocoa Beach, Florida. And according to my late friend Martin Caden, who was an aerospace expert, aviation expert, consultant to NASA, creator of the $6 Million Man through his book Cyborg, wrote the book Marooned, which I'm going to get back to in a moment. He was a science and science fiction writer. And he knew Sybil really well, and it turned out Sybil was an astrologer, among other things. And she did readings for the wives of many of the Mercury 7 and Apollo astronauts. And Marty told me that he was present when she did a reading for one of the astronauts who was going up on Apollo 13, scheduled for 13. The wife was concerned because 13 is an unlucky number. So she contacted Sybil, and Marty was actually present when the reading was done. And it was a disaster reading of some problems with the craft, which of course one might say, well, you know, it's a 13. People are afraid of the number. That might have been it. The reading was actually a copy of the reading apparently was given to NASA. Marty was sure that somebody still had it somewhere at NASA, but he didn't have a copy of it, unfortunately. But what he did from that, he actually wrote Marooned was somewhat inspired by what Sybil had stated for the Apollo 13 mission coming up down the line. So, the astronauts were scheduled well in advance, as it happens. So, and Maroon came out, I think, in 1968. I think the book came out in 67. So Sybil did nail a lot of the actual mechanical issues with 13. So, Dave, the answer was Sybil's psychic. She seemed to be sometimes, at least. And Marty was convinced she was actually fairly psychic, as were a number of the other folks. So that's a really element. When he told me that Sybil Leek was partying with the astronauts and their wives back then, he was too. That didn't surprise me if she was living in Cocoa Beach, based on what I knew from that area. All right, do you know if there's Joe Shield says everyone has psychic abilities? That is correct. Joe Shield is correct, absolutely correct. If you talk to anyone in my field who believes in ESP, because there are a few folks who are unwilling to make their statement that way, but the evidence from what J.B. Ryan looked at, the way we've looked at this phenomena, these experiences, everybody has a potential for some form of psychic functioning. We may have different potentials, and for the most part, we have tamped it down because of our culture and education growing up. And really, if anybody admits to certain types of abilities or tries to demonstrate them, immediately you're weird, you're a phony. There's all sorts of social ramifications for saying that. But everyone does have some degree of psychic ability. And more can be brought out if you really focus on that. So there are ways to do that. Stephen, I have not heard of any consensus among the psychics. I know the majority of them would prefer that it's somebody in particular, or at least one side in particular, or maybe I should say it this way. They prefer it's not somebody. But I don't know that, this is one of those things that if they made a prediction, you don't know how much is biased by what they really want. Because there's obviously serious questions about bias in this with that question. All right, that was a quick kind of slam away. So I'm going to go back for a moment to the sports piece, just because I think it's really interesting, and it relates directly to our field as well. You would vote for Tom Servo, okay? I would vote for Jean-Luc Picard at this point. In that case. So working, because my dad worked with so many athletes, professional athletes, and was working for NBC Sports. He worked for NBC Sports from 1963 until 1980, and then he had his own company and did a lot of sports production for the international market. He had the international rights to the Rose Bowl and the Tournament of Roses parade. I got to know a lot of athletes throughout my growing up. I was even on TV a number of times playing catch with Joe Garagiola, an ex-baseball player, in the pregame show for the Game of the Week for NBC back in the 70s. And Sandy Koufax is a family friend. I played tetherball against Mickey Mantle and Tony Kubek, both ex-Yankees, years ago as a teenager. I met Ken Norton, the boxer, spent time with him, and a number of other folks, and actually got to spend some time with the Pac-10 coaches back in the 90s at a retreat my dad set up out here in California. So one of the things I always talked to them about was extraordinary performance. And I talked to a number of the other folks my dad was connected to about that too, because it seems that when athletes are in the zone, some things happen that exceed the limits that they would normally expect. And that sometimes it's actually even more extraordinary than you think. I was in the mobile unit because I did work some baseball and football games for NBC, both in New York and Chicago, as a runner, basically as a gopher. And there was one game that I was watching, that I was in. It happened to be in the truck. I was glad I was in the truck for that. But there was a pass thrown. I don't remember what the teams were. There was a pass thrown, and it was headed directly for the wide receiver on the same team. But all of a sudden, it made a right angle turn like a UFO and landed into the hands of someone on the other team. So it was intercepted in a really bizarre way. Now, everybody in the truck knew that I was interested in parapsychology. I was in college at that point, and grad school. So they all knew that. So I had a lot of faces turned towards me. It's like, okay, you want to explain that, Lloyd? I don't know what happened. It could not have been a wind. It just would have arced instead of making that right angle turn directly. But there are similar stories that have been told within the sports world. And we also know that people's mindset and psychology pushes them towards extraordinary experience and performance. If you believe something is not going to be done, in other words, you believe you can't do it, you won't. If you don't think about it, you might be able to do it. Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile in 1954, even though physiologists and other people said it was not possible for a human being to do that. Apparently he didn't care or didn't know. And after he ran the 4-minute mile, many people ran the 4-minute mile. So in other words, he set a record, he set a new guidepost or kind of moved the post much higher. And that's a really interesting thing, because when we look at psychokinesis and mind over matter, doubt and disbelief prevent you from doing that. The psychology of doing anything in PK is getting past all that, getting past the ability, the idea that PK is impossible, that maybe somebody else can do it, but when I see something moving, that's not real. That's called witness inhibition. We're inhibited even from admitting to ourselves we saw something like that. And then even the idea that we could do that for most people is scary and makes you think you're weird or strange or even crazy. And that's ownership resistance. And it's all the same thing as in sports performance. So I've had conversations with folks on the faculty at JFK University years ago in the sports psychology group. And the psychology of psychokinesis of mind over matter is the same as sports psychology. It's performance psychology, which is really cool if you think about that. There's that relationship. All right, back to this. So I'm glad, Stephen, you had that experience with Victoria Laurie. I would say, she is someone, for those of you who don't know who she is, look her up on the internet. Victoria Laurie is not only an amazing psychic, definitely get her newsletter. She makes predictions for the future. She is also, because she's been a practicing psychic, she's written a series, a novel series called the Psychic Eye series, about a woman who is a psychic who ends up working with police and FBI. And it has a lot of it feels real to me, having known so many psychics. Maybe not the crimes feeling real, but the whole process, the psychic process she describes, because it's coming from her experience. So I do recommend her for a reading too, if you want to get a good reading from a really good psychic. And she does them obviously online or on the phone as well. Joe Shields says having a heightened energy allows us to connect with our psychic abilities. I think that, and I know Joe pretty well. In fact, I spoke to Joe this week. It is true that if the heightened energy is about how we think about ourselves, and actually it's a heightened mental energy in the sense that we have to put some thought and energy and emotion towards being psychic, to connect with our abilities, to not be afraid of it. And that's a good piece of it for sure. Danya said, someone once told me that prayer is a way of moving energy around. Is it possible that cheering and shouting are also ways of moving energy? Well, we don't know that PK is energy at all, honestly. It somehow uses something in the physical world, but we don't know what's really going on. And energy is just simply too vague a term in this circumstance. But cheering and shouting, putting so much thought, yeah, that's certainly looking for an outcome. It could have been the intercepting receiver who really wanted that ball. It could have been the crowd. The fans might have been more mentally energetic to push that ball over to the other side, that kind of thing. So it's possible. You know, the fans may actually help. I do know that anyone who performs anything for an audience and likes being in front of an audience or is used to being in front of an audience, you want the audience with you. And the more you have audience cheering for you, the better your performance. So that certainly is a form of energy of sorts that can help you. One of the reasons when we started the pandemic that I decided not to perform mentalism over Zoom, which a bunch of magicians have been doing. The guys who are making a full-time living prior to the pandemic did switch to Zoom and started adapting to Zoom shows for mentalism and for magic. And frankly, I didn't like it, just because even with lecturing, teaching classes, you know, when you're in front of an audience and teaching or lecturing or performing, like I perform mentalism, you feel the audience. You can feel when they're not with you. You can feel when they are with you. You can feel that. You can't really feel that over Zoom. So I decided to focus more on the teaching because at least this is information. It's a little different. I prefer to perform for people who preferably appreciate, but at least interact, even if it's unconsciously, for that. Let's see, I wonder if people that are cryogenically frozen are on the other side. That's a really good question. That speaks to the question of where consciousness actually is. Because technically, when you're cryogenically frozen, your brain is dead. I mean, it's inactive. Motion is stopped. So that's going to be interesting to see what happens if they ever figure out how to unfreeze somebody. What that's going to look like. You know, that's a real deep philosophical question, Paul. Might be worth asking some mediums. I'll have to try to remember to ask some mediums next time I talk to them. Maybe I'll ask Joe Shield next time I talk. I'll be talking to him soon. Again, since I'll be doing a class for him for his Journey Within Church group in February, as it happens. Okay. Let's see where we're, all right, so that's where we were kind of stopped right there. Let me mention one other thing about Victoria Laurie. She also wrote a fun Ghostbuster or ghost hunting type series of books. She went far afield in those in terms of kind of fantasy and horror a little bit. And then she also has been writing a series about the sister of the psychic who's a coach. And it's kind of some of the same characters. All right. So, Paul, you signed up for cryonics. You'll let us know. Yeah. So if you know anybody who's cryogenically frozen, that might be able to, we might be able to see if we can contact them through a medium. That might be worth really an interesting experiment. Kind of interesting to do. So, you know, there are experiments that are ongoing right now, or at least have gotten started, that are being funded by grants from the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies to have mediums and channelers actually get so-called wisdom from the other side, you know, to help the world. Mediums talking to spirits, there doesn't seem to be a lot of wisdom coming from most human spirits that are over there. So who knows if anything is going to come through at that point. But it'd be interesting to find out if anybody, I don't know, I personally don't know anybody who's been cryogenically frozen. I think, wasn't Walt Disney frozen? I think he was frozen. All right, quick question about remote viewing. How does one control the year, place viewed? It's just the target. It is, remote viewing is based on, think of it as it's a task-based form of psychic ability, where you're just not simply opening up and saying, give me anything you got. You are focused on what is the target. So if the target could be coordinates on a map, it could be from a photograph, what's inside a building somewhere. It could be someone says, you know, it could be a precognitive where we're going to choose the target after the situation. in terms of year, that should be part of the protocol. If you're trying to go into the future, just keeping in mind that the future is malleable. It does change. And then if it's the past, the biggest problem with doing something into the past is how far back you're going and whether it's provable. So, if one were to do a remote viewing of Camelot, assuming it ever existed, you might pick up on something, but we'd need to know where the archaeological evidence was to prove that it was real and that your description actually matched. That's a really difficult thing to do when we're talking about the past at all. All right, Ted Williams. Okay, so he was frozen and resides in Florida. Yeah. Well, the problem with a non-baseball fan medium, I mean, I know in the past, I've heard, I have read something about Ted Williams back in my early days. We'd need a non-baseball fan who would be able to pick up really specific information about his life, not about his record as a player, because that would be more likely not to be, easy to find. Did you see the trailer for the new Ghostbusters movies? Yes, I did. It's called Frozen Empire. Really looks cool. No pun intended. Very different than the other Ghostbuster movies. And of course, it will be set in New York. So they're back to the firehouse as it happens. And it looks like everybody, of course, but Harold Ramis is in it again. So are the kids, and so is Paul Rudd. So that ought to be pretty interesting. And it's going to be probably another like God or something like that, like Gozer, something like that. It's going to be like, it'll be in there. But I'm looking forward to that. That's coming up this spring. Definitely looking forward to that. Awareness appears to be independent of the body. So what do we do with the body after death? Probably doesn't matter. That's a really good point. I personally think for the cryogenically frozen, like I said, they're dead for all intents and purposes. Consciousness doesn't freeze with the brain unless consciousness is only in the brain. So if you're a materialist, your spirit hasn't left your body because you don't have a spirit. If you are a dualist or some other form of philosophy, probably that consciousness has gone on to another place, whatever that spirit world happens to be. Then the question comes, what if you resurrect that person, resuscitate that person, unfreeze them, and reactivate their brain in some way? Is the consciousness that's in the spirit world going to come back because of that, drawn back, or come back voluntarily? Is some other consciousness going to come in, or is that brain going to develop, which may have memory and everything else intact? Is that brain going to develop some new consciousness, kind of like creating a clone in that sense? Questions we can't answer. You personally think that NDEs were forced to go back to their body because their body was working again. So maybe that is what's going on. Maybe that's what will happen with people being unfrozen. All right. The only thing holding you back from being excited about the new Ghostbusters movie is the director of it is also directed the Poltergeist remake. Yeah. Unfortunately, here's the thing. Sometimes directors are restricted by what script they're given, and they do the best they can with that script. Directors should not take on a script that they're not willing to really work with, but I know that doesn't always work, doesn't always happen. So we have to, I'm going to give the guy the benefit of the doubt, because he is working with Aykroyd. Aykroyd it's his baby. I think Jason Reitman's the producer on that, executive producer on that. So there's still involvement, even though Reitman may not be the director on that. So as long as the script is good and there's oversight by the right people, it should be fine either way. All right. You saw the documentary Rethinking Death. Haven't seen that one yet. Okay. Aykroyd should have directed. I would agree with that. But it's studio sometimes gets involved, obviously, in those decisions as well. So, sometimes there are directors who do a great job. James Wan, who did horror and then did the last Aquaman movie, which is doing this Aquaman movie coming up. The first Aquaman movie was amazing. I just saw a trailer for a movie about, something about some monster or something like that in a swimming pool. Honestly, it looked really stupid. And being directed by James Wan. So choices for that. All right. Other questions, topics. And of course, if you just throw a topic at me, that works really well too. Question for everybody. Have any of you, or have all of you, had the experience of having your printer, your computer, your phone act really weird or start failing when you're under stress or really frustrated because of some other things going on in your life? Just curious if folks have had those kinds of experiences. All right. And I don't see anything yet, but and Dave, I have watched the first episode of Enfield. It's really good. I'll have to watch the rest this week now that I'm off work here. And Graveyard Grog, I know that you work with tech, so curious to see what people come back with. All right. Paul, I assume Aykroyd said his grandfather was not a psychic medium. His grandfather was a psychic researcher. His grandfather was involved with from Canada, but he was involved with the American Society for Psychical Research and was a psychical researcher up in Canada. His dad wrote a really good book called The History of Ghosts. That was much more recent than the original Ghostbusters, though. So Aykroyd was a member of the American Society for Psychical Research. And I know for a fact that on one of my off days when I was working there, he happened to be in the library for the entire day. And nobody called me. I was very mad when I found that out. Okay. All right. Yeah. Extreme coincidence. Yes, some people don't get along with electronics. So here's the thing. We have a literature and research on human-machine interaction. And there's even there are people in Silicon Valley I've talked to over the years, hardware and software people, who have made the observation as well. And in fact, there was government research. The government gave a small grant to Robert Morris at Syracuse University to study human and machine interaction. And the reason the government was interested in that at all was because there was an incident, and probably not the only one, where our NORAD control in Colorado, it looked like the Russians had launched missiles coming across the Pacific, the Bering Straits, at the U.S., according to the radar that they had at NORAD. And it turned out, because of course we have checks and balances, the Alaskan tracking stations, none of their tracking stations picked up any missiles. It was a failure of something like a 97-cent chip in one of the systems. And the person operating the system at the time was under great emotional stress because of stuff going on in his life. He was watching, he was not interacting with the device, but he was sitting there. So the question came up as to whether or not our moods, our emotions, our frustrations, negatively or positively, can affect devices. And the research shows that, yes, that is the case. Morris's experiments included actually having a PC, basically a desktop computer. And what they did was they put a fault in the computer that would randomly short out, basically something that would cause the computer to crash on a random basis, and found that people who hated computers, even if they were just sitting there, The computer crashed significantly more than chance. More importantly, when people really liked computers and were watching the display, it was a kind of a random display that was going on, it didn't short or fail at all. It didn't crash at all. And I actually saw some examples of that in my early days working for the company I work for LexisNexis. So it seems that there are some effects that people do have on our devices. All right. Let's see here. Mew, you grew up with computers. You're better with computers than your parents when you were 10 or something. I think you have better feedback on your electronics instead of breaking them. Yeah, there are people, and I've talked to people in Silicon Valley who said that they knew folks in their companies who were so good. They were what Bob Morris called function linked. They could, if a computer was acting up for whatever reason, they could actually kind of do a laying on of hands of the computer and it would start working fine again. There are people, we can get away from computers now for a minute, get to mechanics, to cars, for example. There have been, one of the things Bob Morris found was that there were mechanics who were known to actually have a positive effect on the cars, but a negative effect for the business. Because people would have problems with their cars and they bring them in, and this one mechanic would go over to try it, and he could never find the fault. The car worked perfectly. Person would drive it off about a block away. It would start crash. It would start having a problem again. They bring it back. As long as this mechanic didn't get near the car, they found the problem. So somehow he was making the car work fine. There was also a guy who was a Xerox installer that Bob found and interviewed in Syracuse, who had the fewest breakdowns of the machines he installed, fewer than anybody apparently in Xerox at the time. This is back in the around very early 80s. And the guy, the thing was that the man would go in and he'd observe the office. He would actually look at the interactions of the people, kind of get a feel for the people just from observing them, and then would tell the office administrator where he was going to put the Xerox machine. And he would convince them that wherever he put it, it was less likely to break down, because those damn things broke down all the time. I was fixing it in our office all the time in the 80s. I just happen to know something about them a little bit. So this guy apparently connected with something to prevent the device from breaking down. And his feeling, what he told Bob, was that it's the emotions and of the people themselves that causes the breakdowns more frequently than the device itself. All right, let's see here. Hi, Indy Night Soccer. Hey there. Okay, Poltergeist 2, your car, very angry. My car is pissed. Okay, well, there are a lot of crappy movies that have come out. Some of which feel bad for the directors getting stuck with those. Sometimes the directors wrote the script themselves, and I don't feel bad for them at all. So it really varies quite a bit. And a lot of times it's the editing. And sometimes it's more than that. There are some well-known movies that tanked at the box office. Actually, a movie I really like is John Carter. And I don't know if you guys have seen John Carter, but it's based on a book, the book series of John Carter of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And it doesn't hold exactly to the story, but it's pretty close to the story. It's a science fiction movie. It got panned at the box office. First of all, it got no promotion from Disney. It's one of the biggest failures of Disney's marketing that has ever happened. In fact, there are books about it. The poster and the name of the name of the movie, John Carter, means nothing to anybody. And unless you happen to know, because even the poster didn't indicate whether it was a science fiction movie or something else, unless you happen to know who John Carter was, you probably didn't even think to go to the movies to see it. My brother cut the trailers for John Carter. My brother has a company in New York that cuts movie trailers, and Disney is one of his clients. And sometimes they give it a rough cut of the film to the editors for the trailer. with some ideas of what to put in the trailer, and other times they give you specific passages or clips and say, you must use these, and here's what we want it to be. And so I was speaking to Ron one day before the movie, well before the movie came out, my brother Ron, and I said, what are you working on? He says, I'm working on this really weird science fiction film, and he starts describing it. And I said, that's John Carter of Mars. He said, oh yeah, it's John Carter. I don't get it. Now, my brother was not a fan of Burroughs at all, and he's not a science fiction fan. He didn't get it. He had no idea it had any connection at all. None of the marketing connected it to Edgar Rice Burroughs. None of it connected to the fact that it was the 100th anniversary of A Princess of Mars, which was basically the initial John Carter story. And then people were complaining that there was too much. There were too many things that were from Star Wars or Flash Gordon. Like there's a lion type character or entity called a Banth, and of course there's these elephant things in Star Wars called Banthas. Where do you think that George Lucas got Bantha from? Somebody for Forbes magazine who actually had read it was not called John Carter of Mars. It was just called John Carter. That was the problem. If they had added of Mars, it might have done a lot better. So this guy from Forbes wrote a review, and he basically scolded all the other critics because he actually had read Edgar Rice Burroughs. He knew that all the things the critics were complaining about, that it was too derivative of Star Wars and that it was the other way around. He knew that Star Wars was derivative of Burroughs books and Flash Gordon and other things. And Lucas mentioned that. I think even Lucas was quoted in the Forbes article about that. So you have sometimes really stupid decisions made by studios, whether it's the director. So we'll have to see if it was a stupid decision by the studio to have this guy direct the new Ghostbusters movie. There are a lot of things that go on. Editing is a big problem. A lot of times that's why there are director's cuts, because the initial cut of the movie, which is often interfered by Hollywood executives who don't know anything about their audience, can be a problem. It was listed on the stock exchange. It's too bad it wasn't listed to the public that way. Yeah, really too bad. Anyway, that was my little tirade. Having been a fan of, I'm still a fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs. All right, Ryu, you forgot to say, and usually angry in front of your computers, consoles, but I know you love them. That's always good. Yeah, the Lord of the Rings extended edition trilogy. Sometimes directors also do things that you question their decisions otherwise too. I will say that the Snyder cut of the Justice League, which is 4 hours long, is much better than the original cut of the Justice League. And I'm hopefully we're at some point we're going to see the David Ayer cut of Suicide Squad, which was very different apparently than what was released to the theaters and got panned. It's a weird thing. And then you have situations like Army of Darkness with Bruce Campbell, one of my favorite movies of all time. I have 4 versions of Army of Darkness. There have been a director's cut. There was a cut by Sam Raimi. There was a director's cut. There was another cut, the Boomstick edition, and all these other different editions with slight changes, minor changes, which are fun. They're not only extended; they sometimes have the original ending. It makes sense to kind of milk the Evil Dead stuff for as much as possible, if you can. All right. Anybody have any last parapsychology or paranormal questions? We're at the last 5 minutes of this last session of 2023. Anybody want to toss in there? You're going to be meeting Sam Raimi. Very cool. That's very cool. All right. Yeah. So anybody have any favorite ghost movies they want to pop in the chat there to talk about? I'll mention my all-time favorite ghost movie right off the top. It's called The Time of Their Lives. I've mentioned it before. It's an Abbott and Costello film. And it's not your usual Abbott and Costello film. It's really worth watching. It's a lot of fun. Really cool little seance scene at the end, too. Any new interviews in the horizon? I think so. I have to post a couple of links of more recent ones, but I think trying to remember. I think I've got a couple things scheduled for January. I'll have to look and see. Nothing for the rest of the year. I was supposed to do one last week, but they had to push it back. So chocolate. I mentioned early on, just mentioned again, for anybody who's close to a Trader Joe's, try to go in there and for $10, get their chocolate passport, which is a little box set of chocolate bars, 7 of them from 7 different countries. Really cool way of doing a chocolate tasting and seeing how different countries' cacao actually tastes. Also, I mentioned right up front that I'm teaching 3 classes starting in the first full week of February. One of them is the field investigations class. So think of it as Ghost Hunting 101. That's an 8-week class. I am teaching a 4-week class on the technology used in parapsychology and paranormal investigation. I'm going to be taking a critical look at tech, at EVP, at instrumental transcommunication, at environmental sensors, at all the different things as well. And then I'm teaching a course called Dreams and Altered States of Consciousness and their relation to psychic ability as well. All right, Paul, Ghost Town. Really like that movie. That's another really fun movie. The best ghost movies are either dramas like the movie Ghost or they're comedies. And even Ghost had a little bit of comedy to it. Tina enjoyed the 3rd Doctor Who special. I did too. I really enjoyed all 3 of them. All right, Mew, hope you have a good question. Let's see. Oh, survival, Paul. That class will be taught in the spring, so it'll be starting in May. That will be the survival class. And the other class I'll be teaching in May will be the parapsychology and anthropology class, and then a 4-week class on developing your psychic ability, developing ESP. Yeah, I got you, Paul. All right. And Mew, do you have a new good question? Is that a new question or are you referring to your old other one? Oh, I haven't watched the Goosebumps series on Disney yet. I'm planning on watching that real soon as well. All right, let's see what else we have here. And by the way, I can see the comments sometimes before they're actually hitting the screen. So I'm a little ahead of the game here sometimes. All right, we just have a couple minutes left. No other ghost movies. I'm really surprised. The folks have nothing they want to talk about or throw in there. All right, I recommend also Just Like Heaven with Reese Witherspoon and Mark Ruffalo. Not strictly a ghost movie, but do poltergeist cases show that the subconscious is stronger than the consciousness? I would say that what they show is that the rules that we consciously abide by and have taken to heart don't apply. They don't apply in our dream state. They don't apply in some other altered states of consciousness. All bets are off, basically, and the subconscious has access to, without having to worry about consequences, to more psychic functioning because it's not being run through our conscious filters in that way. Personal Shopper with Kristen Stewart. That's a ghost movie, Dave? Okay. Coraline. That's a good one. Yeah. All right. I have to look up Personal Shopper. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining me for tonight and for any other time this past year. For when I was back on the Kluge Facebook platform as well. I want to thank my producer, Graveyard Grog, who is a big help and been a real great person to get to know. So, okay, Dave, I'm going to look that one up. Yeah, thank you, Gary. Thank you. You should take a bow for sure. All right. So thank you, everybody. Wish you all a happy new year. I wish you all happy holidays for whatever holidays you're celebrating. Is it true that Santa Claus is actually a collective like the Borg? Yeah, I guess resistance is futile. Happy holidays, everybody. Take care, and may the force be with you.